Please type your questions into the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will collect the questions for the panelists and then have them address the questions at the Q&A period at the end of the event. And with that, I will turn the event over to Michèle Lamont, Director of the Weatherhead Center. Michèle.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special session on U.S. election results, domestic and international implications. So results, now results. We are in the middle of much confusion, but fortunately we have three distinguished political scientists who will help us interpret what is the situation. As a sociologist, I can certainly tell you that the country appears to be more divided than ever. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. This is the session organized by the Weatherhead Forum, which brings together the members of the Weatherhead community every 2 weeks, but this semester, given Zoom fatigue, we're meeting less often and having panels such as this one that creates conversation around important topics. So today, I'm extremely pleased that we have three speakers, Theda Skocpol, Stephen Walt, and Danielle Allen. The session has been co-organized in collaboration with two of our research clusters, the Response to Democracy cluster, which is organized by Danielle Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, and our security cluster, which is organized by a number of security experts in the Department of Government, including Ian Johnston and Josh Kurtzler. So Theda Skocpol is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology in the Department of Government and Sociology at Harvard. And her work, we all know, covers a broad spectrum of topics, including healthcare reform, public policy, and civic engagement amidst the shifting inequalities and partisan polarization in American democracy. Her most recent book, a collective volume, is titled Upending American Politics, Polarizing Parties, Ideological Elite, and Citizen Activism from the Tea Party to the Anti-Trump Resistance, with Caroline Turvo. Stephen Walt is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's associated with the Realist School in International Politics and is an expert in national security, foreign policy, US-Europe relations, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. He has written about alliances, revolution, and the declining influence of the US long before it became a fashionable topic. And his most recent book is The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of US Primacy. And finally, Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University professor and the director of the Safra Center for Ethics here at Harvard. She's the former chair of the Mellon Foundation Board and past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. A classicist and political theorist, she has published broadly on democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. She's widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America. And she has been working on a new book on the classical problem of political theory, Difference Without Domination. So each panelist will speak for roughly 20 minutes. And unfortunately, Theda has to leave us to teach at 1:30, so she will disappear in the middle of the Q&A, but we will have a chance to have her address some of the questions at the beginning of the question period. So, and the three panelists will present in the order that I've introduced them, starting with Theda and then Steve and Danielle. So Theda, do you want to get started?
Yes, thank you very much, Michèle, and it's an honor to be asked to be on this panel with Danielle and Stephen, and I look forward to the discussion. The election reached a pivot point last night, so it's been a long night, and it's another set of surprises in an unfolding drama in American politics that's been full of twists, turns, and surprises for a decade now. The current state of play, as I understand it, in the presidential contest is that with the counting of mailed-in ballots and absentee ballots in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the other states that remain in play, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina, Joe Biden is on track to get at least 270 electoral college votes, perhaps exactly 270 electoral college votes. We can be pretty sure of his lead in Michigan and in Wisconsin. We have many hours to wait for the counting of ballots, in early mail ballots in Pennsylvania, of which there are probably about 1 million. That means, and the other big story from this election so far, and I think it will play out this way, is that the presidency may go one way, but the Democratic Party and the pollsters that we all were following were dead wrong about what would happen beneath the level of the presidency. The Senate is not going to be in Democratic hands. Mitch McConnell is going to continue as majority leader of the Senate because Tom Tillis in North Carolina and Susan Collins in Maine have been reelected, and Joni Ernst in Iowa, and it may go to a partial runoff in Georgia, but that's a long ways away and would not be enough. And perhaps most surprising, the Democratic House is going to be down at least 10 seats rather than gaining 10 to 20 as everyone was predicting. And many opportunities for Democrats to make gains in state houses that will be making redistricting decisions for the next decade have been lost in this outcome. So let me just say a couple things very quickly for my part of this, because I don't have slides and I haven't had time to parse all the numbers, and all the numbers aren't even there. In recent years, since 2016, I have been visiting and keeping in touch with 8 counties, non-metropolitan counties, that went for Donald Trump in 2016. 4 small town centered places and 4 medium city centered places, 2 apiece in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And 7 out of 8 of those counties, Donald Trump increased his margins in this election over what they were in 2016, even though most of those places were early on hard hit by the pandemic or have been hit very hard, particularly the 2 in Wisconsin most recently. So that gives me a microcosm into, I haven't been able to visit these places in the last few months, but I've kept in touch with the various local party and civic and business leaders and religious leaders that I had met in my field travels. That gives me some insight into what the experience of those places and leaders in them has been during these tumultuous years, and particularly the tumultuous last 9 months. And I would say that that's something that we need as social scientists, to add that kind of contextualized knowledge and interpersonal information to the kinds of things we learn or fail to learn from highly aggregate statistical analyses and national polls. I'm going to say that national polls were completely misleading in this election episode. We're going to hear, and we're already hearing from national pollsters that, yeah, they said there was a margin of error and it could go either way. I mean, I can write that piece from Nate Silver. I think he's already written it. But let's face it, we were told that 8 points or more was the margin of likely victory for Joe Biden in Wisconsin, Michigan, and 5 points in Pennsylvania. And although he may in the end win all 3 of those places, he will do so barely, tens of thousands of votes at most. Margins greater than Donald Trump won them by in 2016, but nothing like what was predicted. That suggests that this should be a moment of great humility and pause for some serious thinking over weeks and months among social scientists and political analysts who have relied very heavily on highly aggregated, non-network, non-community-based data to try to understand how Americans are understanding and experiencing social and political change in this period. And I can say that I intend to engage in a lot of that thinking before I reach firm conclusions. I have a couple of questions that I want to throw out that I think we should be thinking about. Given that it's pretty obvious that the metro, non-metro divide widens still further in this election over what it has been before, I think we need to be asking how people living and working in those different places have experienced the economic changes, the racial crisis, and above all, the pandemic that has unfolded. I also wonder, as somebody who studied both the Tea Party movement, which created local meeting groups all over the country, and then the anti-Trump resistance, which created about 3,000 female-led voluntary groups that were remaking the Democratic Party from the bottom up in the period between 2016 and 2018, and accounted for the blue wave of women particularly, but all kinds of Democratic candidates that ran for offices at all levels, and the volunteers who went door to door to reach their neighbors and turn out voters to create the blue wave election in 2018. We need to ask ourselves why that didn't carry over more fully into this presidential contest. Yes, I think it will help to put Joe Biden barely over the top. And I know that many of these female-led grassroots groups have been throwing their weight into the cause in settings all over the country, improving margins in counties that didn't go for Biden, but nevertheless create votes that help to put him over the top, helping to organize in the suburbs in particular, where these groups have been particularly dense on the ground. But is there something about the pandemic crisis that has made it, that cut short the kind of revitalization of person-to-person contacting that was going on leading into 2018, and that was largely suspended, especially on the Democratic Party side, more than on the Republican and conservative side, in the last 9 months leading into this presidential contest? I think that's a question to ask very seriously, particularly if the outcome turns out to be a president installed with practically no ability to move legislation or count on support in many states that might have happened if the blue wave phenomena of 2018 had carried forward into victories across the board for Democrats in 2020. And the final thing I'll say is that we're entering a period in which the United States is going to be weakened further in its capacity to govern in the face of daunting crises, environmental crisis, racial crisis, health crisis, and an economy that I fear now will go into stagnation for many years, and particularly widen the divides between the Zoom class of professionals who can work from home at full salary and everyone else who will be dealing with work in small business settings or in face-to-face settings that are going to be already are being radically restructured by this economic downturn. It will be very hard for the US federal government to stimulate the economy and to institute reforms that are important in both our democracy and our increasingly unequal economy, to create the new supports for working families that are so obviously needed, above all in a combined health and economic crisis like the one we're living through. But on the positive, and that's not to speak to the international decline that will continue for America's reputation, which I'm sure Stephen Walt will speak to. I'll just conclude by saying that I think it's very important for experts and citizens alike, after the dust settles on this election, and believe me, the votes will be counted. They will be reported by local authorities and state authorities. No tweeting president, and not even the most Federalist Society judges, are going to prevent the counting of the votes and the tallying up that will decide who the next president is going to be. If it turns out to be Joe Biden, that kind of Democratic president who has spoken about the need to reweave the ties that bind Americans across their differences is going to need active citizen support at the local level to magnify and carry through that message through civic and social action, even when legislation is not possible. So I think there remains a lot for engaged citizens to do. We've just gone through an election that has witnessed the highest voter turnout in 120 years. Nearly 67% of eligible voters voted in this election. Obviously, they voted on both sides of a polarized polity. But there's going to be a lot for Americans who care about building bridges and revitalizing civic life and supporting what government action is possible if it turns out to be a Biden presidency starting on January 21st. So let me leave it at that.
These are really such thoughtful comments, Theda. I'm extremely grateful. And now we're going to follow up with Stephen Walt.
Oh, great. It's nice to be speaking here. And I want to begin by echoing Theda's advice that we adopt an attitude of humility here. And I'm going to emphasize that in several different ways. My preliminary point speaks exactly to that. I mean, foreign policy is a realm of surprises. And the first point to note is that presidents often face challenges on the international stage they never thought about, and they wind up doing things they never intended to do. If you think back, George Bush ran for office in 1999, 2000, saying he was opposed to nation building. He was going to focus on great power relations. He gets blindsided by 9/11 and ends up acting very differently. Barack Obama doesn't see the Arab Spring coming. It blew his foreign policy off course in a number of ways. Donald Trump didn't expect to face a devastating pandemic. So the first point to make is that whatever either Biden or Trump thinks they're going to do in the next 4 years, circumstances abroad are going to surprise them, at least in some ways, and their reactions may surprise all of us. So I want to do three things. I'm going to start with what I think is now the most likely case, although just barely, which is that Biden wins, but the Democrats don't take the Senate, as Theda said. I'll start with that, then I'll talk about what a Trump second term would look like, and then say a little bit about what we know, regardless of what the ultimate outcome at the presidential level is. So starting with Biden, to a first approximation, Biden is basically getting the Obama band back together again. Biden and most of his team are pretty familiar faces. We're talking about Michèle Flournoy, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Susan Rice, Julie Smith, Bill Burns, my colleague Nick Burns, et cetera, and a lot of mid-level people that you may not have heard of. And this team embraces a lot of familiar ideas. They're suspicious of Russia. They're committed to our allies in Europe and Asia. They place a high value on US leadership, the need to cooperate on things like climate change. They like democracy. They support the Iran nuclear deal, but they're not particularly Iran friendly. They will be tougher on China than Obama was, but they'll want to do that in partnership with other countries. They won't give our Middle East allies quite the same blank check that Trump has, but they're not going to play hardball with any of them either. And if you think about how the rest of the world is likely to react, well, most countries will heave a sigh of relief if this is the team they're dealing with. A recent Pew survey of 13 American allies showed a median level of only 34% with a favorable view of the United States at this point. Remember, those are US allies, and Trump's median approval rating in those 13 countries was only 16%. So again, there'll be a sigh of relief if Trump is really gone. So then the question is, well, will Biden bring back the sort of old style foreign policy and succumb to the same sort of hubris that I think has characterized American foreign policy ever since the end of the Cold War? And I don't think that's going to be the case. First of all, some of Biden's advisors, I think, have learned from the past and are singing a very different tune now than they might have sung earlier. There is zero interest in regime change. There's real skepticism about extreme globalization. One of Biden's closest advisors, Jake Sullivan, keeps saying we need a foreign policy for the middle class, by which he means one that protects jobs more effectively and sounds much more like Bernie Sanders than it sounds like Bill Clinton back in the 90s. You still hear a lot about the rules-based order and the need to protect that, but not very much about actively trying to spread democracy to other countries. Second, the world has changed. They're not going to be able to turn the clock back to 2016 because other countries have moved on. Trump woke up the Europeans, who now recognize they can't rely on axiomatic US support, and they're not going back to sleep either. You could argue that's good, that Europe should take more responsibility for its own security. And a Biden administration will certainly want to work with Europe on issues of digital governance, climate, global health, and things like that. But the United States is not going to be able to dictate to its allies in Europe or Asia the way it used to. And I would say nobody will be looking to the United States as a model for how to govern a country, even if Biden becomes president. The other reason, of course, is that he's going to face a daunting domestic agenda. We have a pandemic, a stagnant economy, record deficits, racial division, deep polarization. Foreign policy can't be completely ignored, but he has to start by at least trying to address problems here at home, and at a moment when 40% of the public will probably believe that Donald Trump was the real winner. Finally, we shouldn't forget that Biden will be constrained by the Democratic Party's progressive wing, which is going to push back on defense spending, on things like the Yemen war, possibly on China policy. My point is that he won't have a free hand on foreign policy, even within his own party, which is another reason not to be too ambitious and keep foreign policy on the back burner. In short, whether he wants to or not, I think a Biden administration is going to conduct a relatively restrained foreign policy. Yes, they'll try to take us back into the Paris Agreement on climate. They may try to negotiate multilateral agreements on digital governance, global health, reform of the World Trade Organization. But remember, the Republicans will oppose those efforts at every turn, and they won't be able to get a treaty through a Senate that they don't control. One last point here. Joe Biden is 77 and there's a pandemic underway. He is not going to be hopping on Air Force One every other week and flying off to a lot of foreign capitals or summit meetings. It means he's going to delegate a lot of foreign policy to his subordinates, and that means who gets different jobs really does matter. One final point here, because he has a big team of advisors with a lot of very long resumes, he's going to have trouble finding jobs for everybody. If you're Susan Rice and you've already been National Security Advisor and UN Ambassador, the only job you'd be willing to take is probably Secretary of State, but there are a number of other people who want that position too. So this game of musical chairs is going to be pretty competitive. And finally, you should ask, well, does Biden appoint anyone from the Sanders or AOC wing of the party? Somebody like Matt Duss, who is Sanders' main foreign policy advisor, does he get an important position? And if so, what is that job? Progressives are not going to be happy if they're shut out completely from the Biden foreign policy team. I think he will tell that team that job number one is to reassure traditional friends overseas, keep things calm and avoid surprises. But as I said at the start, foreign policy is one area where surprises are to be expected. All right, well, what about Trump? What if everything goes contrary to current expectations and Donald Trump does in fact get a second term? Well, his first term could be characterized as Donald versus the blob. He came in challenging many orthodoxies, very disdainful of the foreign policy establishment, appointed a number of oddballs like Stephen Bannon and Michael Flynn, or neophytes like Rex Tillerson. And I think overall, he got captured to a large extent by the foreign policy establishment, not in terms of his diplomatic style, which remained unique, even unprecedented. And he did a number of things that, say, Hillary Clinton would not have done, leaving the Iran deal, for example. But he didn't leave NATO. His trade wars didn't transform the world economy. The meetings with Kim Jong-un did not lead North Korea to disarm. He didn't get us out of Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan. In fact, like Barack Obama, he sent more troops to Afghanistan initially. He gave blank checks to our Middle East allies, but we've been doing that for years anyway. And he didn't really transform US relations with anyone. Over time, he began to rely more on people drawn straight from the foreign policy establishment: James Mattis, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, John Kelly, and they reined him in to a considerable extent for most of the first term. But over time, he's learned, and he's been able to gradually put what I would call Trumpian loyalists into more and more key positions. I'd count Secretary of State Pompeo there, Richard Grenell at the CIA, John Radcliffe as Director of National Intelligence, Mark Esper as Secretary of Defense. And these people were chosen ultimately for their deference to Trump and loyalty, not necessarily for their competence. If he gets a second term, this process is going to continue. Experienced professionals are going to leave in droves. Trumpian zealots with relatively little experience will take over more and more jobs. And if you've been paying attention in the last few weeks, he's also talked about trying to weaken civil service protections, the overall objective there making him even less accountable. Most important of all, if Trump does in fact get a second term, he's going to feel completely unconstrained. If he can retain the presidency despite losing the popular vote, having bungled a pandemic in which nearly a quarter of Americans died, and with the economy performing badly, he's not going to feel he needs to pay any attention at all to domestic politics. His attention will be either on getting a third term or passing the presidency off to a loyalist. What does this mean for foreign policy? I think if he's president, you'll see continued pressure on China, especially with regard to advanced technology. No effort on climate, on multilateral trade reform, or on other issues of global governance. American unilateralism, America first, will increase even more. They may try to get Iran to sign a new nuclear deal, but they'll insist on zero enrichment, and Iran will reject that. I think NATO will then be on borrowed time unless it agrees to go along with the United States pretty much across the board, say vis-a-vis China. I think knowing this, Europeans will continue to hedge in various ways, such as trying to develop alternatives to the dollar-backed financial system. And last point, what is going to be true no matter who wins? Well, even if Trump is no longer president, this election clearly did not repudiate Trumpism. One possibility, he runs again in 2024, and that campaign will begin whenever he steps down. The Republican Party, Fox News, may treat him in this period as essentially our alternative president, leading other states to wonder exactly who is speaking for the country. If he decides to bow out, then the battle to succeed him in the Republican Party will feature Pompeo, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton. All of them are hawkish, and Rubio is really the only one who's a genuine internationalist. All of them will be seeking Trump's blessing. The election, I think, has confirmed that the United States is deeply polarized, and as Theda suggested, this has serious consequences for government, serious consequences for foreign policy. It makes it harder for us to take timely action on any of the issues the country needs to deal with. It makes it easier for foreign powers to manipulate us. And it makes it harder to reach meaningful agreements with other countries because they can't trust any American president and any commitment they might make, because that commitment might be reversed after the next election. Again, even traditional American allies have to hedge. So who was the big winner last night? Well, if I had to pick one, I'd say it was Xi Jinping. The United States is even less likely to be able to deal effectively with the COVID pandemic, regardless of who's president. We're going to be less able to address our internal divisions, crumbling infrastructure, and all sorts of much needed institutional reforms. The American political system will continue to look to the rest of the world like it's dysfunctional, making Chinese-style state capitalism look better despite its many problems. Other states will be even less willing to follow America's lead, even if a Biden administration tries to point the way and tries to enlist them. So if you're an American adversary, in short, last night was pretty good news. Maybe not the best news, but good news nonetheless. I will stop there and look forward to hearing what Danielle has to say.
Well, hopefully Danielle can make us feel a little bit more optimistic given the first two presentations. Danielle, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Michèle. And as Theda said, it's an honor to be here with all of you and to listen to Theda and Steve, masters of the territory without any question. I'm going to focus on what the last 4 years have meant for the country from the perspective of civic education. Now, this may seem like a remote question, but I actually think it's quite fundamental to ascertaining what happens next, where we go from here. The last 4 years have robustly delivered solutions to problems in civic education that this country has had for quite some time. So at a very basic level, Americans generally in the routine surveys report pretty low level understanding of our political institutions. The Trump administration and fights over Trump's governance, including the impeachment battle, have given Americans an education in the structure of constitutional democracy that is unparalleled in recent decades. So one thing we know about where we are is that the American public actually has rebuilt some of its foundational knowledge about the operations of a constitutional democracy. So that's a silver lining. And I'm going to come back to sort of what these silver linings add up to in a second. A second way in which the last 4 years and then this election have, again, sort of solved for longstanding problems of civic education is that it's been the case, again, for decades, that it's very, very hard to turn out voters without college degrees. One of the biggest gaps in voting was between those with college degrees and those without college degrees. And for whatever else we want to say about the president, he has really addressed a solution and delivered a solution to that problem. So we have a fully engaged electorate, as Theda said, the highest turnout in 120 years. And what is really extraordinary about that is the massive increase in turnout from non-college educated voters. So there's value in that as well. Again, another silver lining, which I will come back to in a moment. The third element of civic education that the last 4 years in this election have delivered is one that we have still not fully grasped, but it relates to the point what Theda was making about research and how we ought to take a different approach to polling. The third piece of learning is that our constitutional democracy is fundamentally designed as a state-based system. It is not based on national populations. So this is what we saw in 2016, caused by surprise, but it is what we should have understood going into 2020 in terms of how we are analyzing the politics of the race. If one recognized that the system is designed as a state-based federation, fundamentally that is a sort of defining characteristic, one would analyze the state of the race in different places differently than we did do. So as Theda said, we would be a heck of a lot less interested in national aggregate polling. That is really misdirection in terms of understanding the dynamics of our political system. One would have to look at a state-based picture, and polling is useful there, but it can't tell the full story. It is also about networked connections, and here the transformation of our media ecosystem is fundamental. We currently live in a world where those states that voted in a blue direction are networked in one media ecosystem. Those voting in a red direction are sharing information, sharing knowledge, understanding in a very different way. That's partly about Fox News, but it's not only about Fox News. And I think researchers are a very long way from understanding the transformation of the communications ecosystem that's driving sort of very diverse sort of framings of the key public issues in front of us. I don't think we will actually get back to a place where we can accurately predict and project outcomes of elections until we have a full understanding of the transformation of the communications networks and communications ecosystem in the country. So 3 silver linings then, the education and the operations of our constitutional democracy, the question of the relationship between the branches and their relative and respective powers, the silver lining around turning out non-college educated voters, and then finally the silver lining of this restoration of recognition that we live in this state-based federation, and we have to think about it, analyze it that way first, not from a sort of national aggregate picture. So where does that leave us? Can that silver lining deliver anything of value to us? I think it can, in fact, deliver several things. So for starters, the turnout and the reconnection of non-college educated voters to the electorate means that now as we debate hard problems in our society, we actually know where we're starting from. The election provides the clearest picture of the spread of American public opinion that we could ask for. And again, the sort of turnout is critical to that. And so in that regard, it should change how the parties go about their work, particularly the Democratic Party, which at this point really needs to understand that it's not going to be able to get where it wants to go, just sort of shaking additional votes out of the trees. And the same really is true for the Republicans. At this point, the sort of trees have been shaken. We get a picture of a 50-50 balance. The job now is really to reach across the division and figure out how to recruit voters back to a party when they've left. And insofar as non-college educated voters are the group that has made the biggest impact in terms of changing our understanding of the electorate, that's the job. It really is a question of how can non-college educated voters experience and perspectives be heard, be integrated, be reconciled with the perspectives of urban voters, whether college educated or not, and can we in fact craft a justice vision, so to speak, that can actually integrate those perspectives. That's the work to be done. It's surprising in some sense the Democratic Party didn't do more of that work between 2016 and the present. But that goes to an additional point, another sort of silver lining, which is that we can probably all finally get past the notion that 2016 was Hillary's fault as a personal matter. This election result is extremely similar to the 2016 election result, and so that tells us that it really is fundamentally about our politics and about a changing shape of the electorate and the ways in which the two parties are engaging with the electorate. So given the degree of polarization, given the fact that the job is to rethink for each party how it aims to build its draw beyond 50%, aims to, in the Democratic case, reconnect non-college educated voters. In the Republican case, aims to actually take seriously the concerns of minority voters in urban areas in particular. How are we likely to find our way forward? Our national elected federal officials are operating in an extremely bitter, divisive environment, very unlikely to give each other quarter. So the answer is probably going to have to come someplace else. Like Theda, I think the answer is probably going to have to come at the level of local engagement and civic action. In particular, I think our mayoral core across the country is the place where we are most likely to find solutions to the pressing problems for working families, to the kinds of problems that actually require solution across what look like partisan divides. Clearly, one of the biggest challenges and problems is a cultural one, a cultural debate about race and its importance in our country's history. Also debates about religion and sexuality. So at the end of the day, mayors across America's communities are in a really distinctive position responsible for knitting communities together across divides, delivering a foundation for well-being at a local level that has to touch everybody in their community. So I think we need to look to them for policy paradigms. We need to look to them for vocabulary and language that helps us begin to have a way of telling a story that rebuilds the possibility of common purpose. Now, that's not just a sort of romantic notion. It's quite important insofar as the country's ability to govern at a federal level and its ability to function effectively internationally actually does depend on getting past this bitter polarization. So we have to really draw a circle around that local work of reknitting a sense of shared understanding and common purpose as a key political project, one that is fundamental to the health of the nation generally, both domestically and internationally. The last thing I want to say about yesterday's election results, the parts that we do know about, as opposed to the parts that we're still waiting for, is that there were a couple of interesting democracy reform experiments on the ballot in different places. And the truth is they did so-so. So I'll just call out one. Ranked choice voting was on the ballot here in Massachusetts, Proposition 2. It was also on the ballot in Alaska. Did a little bit better here in Massachusetts than Alaska, came in at about 55 to 45. But the interesting thing about the voting results there is that once again, they track exactly that divide between the networked, affluent, educated voters and voters who are in smaller, more dispersed rural communities without necessarily the same frequency of college degrees, without access to telecommuting options in the case of this pandemic. So the democracy reform, democracy innovation case currently is vulnerable in the same way that the rest of our politics is vulnerable. It hasn't yet found a way of knitting together the concerns of those without college degrees, those in rural locations, and those concerns of people in urban contexts. So the political work in front of us is clear, and the hope is that the clarity of the message delivered by yesterday's results finally inspires action on the part of both parties to reconsider how they do business. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you. Masterful presentation. You just put a lot on the table. As our audience is collecting its thought and preparing question, I thought that I would throw in one or two questions and also ask you to engage with one another, since I'm sure you have reactions. So to start with Danielle's conclusion, it seems that the big challenge ahead is really to understand better the class divide and get the upper middle class to be a little bit, and that's something we've been talking certainly since 2016, more aware of the limitations of their own worldviews. And I think maybe we need a very broad conversation about the place of the American dream in where we're heading, and the place of meritocracy and the ways in which class boundaries are oriented in a direction that always favors the college-educated population. So we haven't talked a lot about the economy in your comments or the growing diversity of American society. So maybe I would ask you to, how does this issue of the growing salience of the class divide playing off those two dimensions? And also, if you have any comments to add in response to the other presentation, I'd be grateful to hear what you have to say. Do you want Theda, who has focused so much on the importance of civic involvement, do you have thoughts about how we bridge these divides?
Let me say a couple things. I mean, I certainly obviously agree with a lot of what Danielle had to say. I will point out that ranked choice voting as a specific reform has worked well in Maine, and Maine has one of the least college credentialed proportions in its population. The other thing I guess I'm going to say, and I guess I'm going to be contradicting myself to some degree, I don't think that the Republican Party is going to conclude. Much of my research is about organized conservatives in the United States. And I would make a distinction between grassroots conservatives and elite conservatives. So let me speak about elite conservatives in and around the direction of the Republican Party. And I think the lesson they are going to learn from the last 4 years and from this election is that polarization works very, very well indeed. And I don't think they're the slightest bit interested in broadening the coalition that they are mobilizing or in touch with. I think they're interested in locking in self-reinforcing minority rule. And by that, I don't just mean racial minority. It's actually a substantial chunk of whites that are their base, but minority in the sense of not winning actual majorities in elections. So I think the greatest tragedy of this particular outcome is that it's going to make it very difficult to put through a series of national reforms that would reinforce making voting easy and making connection around mobilizing people into civic discussions as well as voting possible going forward. We will have to look to the states not just the cities, to do more of that. And I think it would be well advised for people on the Democratic side or the center side and those Republicans who understand that trying to lock in anti-democratic authoritarian populism is not a good idea. I think it would be good for them to focus more of their energy on the link between state government as an effective intermediate level of governance that really has stepped forward in many places during this pandemic, and vital local communities. So that's a change of direction for Democrats who have focused almost all their energy on national government and on the presidency. And, you know, poor President Biden, if he is inaugurated on January 20th, is not going to be able to bear that weight. He simply is not. So there's going to have to be a new set of connections and revitalizations below the level of the presidency, even for him to realize the message that he has put forward, which I think is very much one of civic unity during this election. So let me just say that. I mean, the problem of an authoritarian Republican Party that has married ultra free market, big money politics with ethno-nationalist populism and around the cause of using institutions and rules to lock in anti-democratic rule. That problem is worse now, not better. And there's no point in assuming that kumbaya language will solve that.
Okay. Stephen, or Danielle, you want to add something?
Well,
Sure.
since Theda has opened the door to contradicting ourselves, let me do that too. So I suggested that Biden presidency would want to keep foreign policy on the back burner and focus on trying to accomplish some things here at home. And in doing that, I think the goal of a Biden administration would be to play for 2022. For example, a situation where there are far more Republican senators up for re-election than Democrats. So the playing field will favor the Democrats in terms of aggregate numbers in 2022. You could imagine him sort of trying to stall. He's not going to get much done for 2022 and then do a lot in the second half of the first term. This leads him into an awkward little trade-off. On the one hand, the one place where presidents have more latitude and don't require a lot of Senate support is in foreign policy. There's certain things you can't do, but you can do an awful lot in foreign policy without having to go get Mitch McConnell's permission to do that. The problem is most Americans don't care that much about foreign policy, and especially not in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of an economic recession. So, a great multilateral agreement on digital architecture with our European allies will matter not at all for most voters outside of the zip code that we're currently in, or Washington, D.C., or maybe New York and Silicon Valley. And so Biden can do things in foreign policy, but that's not going to help him politically. Or he can try to do things at home that might help him politically, but he won't get anything done. And I think that's the real problem. And in terms of the long arc of sort of America's role in the world, it's why I concluded by saying this is good for American rivals, because we're not going to be able to address any of the economic, infrastructure, inequality, and national unity questions that are currently undermining America's position in the world and are likely to continue regardless of which of these presidents ends up actually getting inaugurated in January.
So just two small points. I mean, I agree with Theda that this election has locked in the minoritarian power position that the Republicans have been pursuing. And has shown them its validity, its viability. And again, that relates to the state-based structure of our institutions, the Electoral College, the functioning of the Senate, and so forth. On the other hand, I think the reason it matters is because it is a sort of power that's held on the razor's edge. And it is a kind of power that ought to be, the Democratic Party, if it reorients itself in its work, ought to be able to knock off. And so in that regard, again, I don't think that the Republicans are tomorrow going to turn around and try to work in any sort of way to broaden towards above 50% because they don't need to. But they could be pressured by the Democrats in ways that change the dynamic inside their party. But this is a place where I do think we have to look squarely at the fact that this is a substantial victory for Trumpism, whatever the actual outcome of the presidency is. We now have to take measure of its full shape, and that's where the Democratic Party has to engage. And that's where I think it gets kind of complicated to describe it as being a matter of needing to think about class politics. I think honestly that throws us back to paradigms of analysis that don't quite meet the moment. And that is because of the points that Theda was making about the urban sort of metro-rural splits and contrasts. They don't map onto the kind of class dynamic analyses that we're used to from previous decades. So we have to do new analytic work, I think, to really understand what the cleavages are and where they might be counteracted.
Okay, well, that brings us to a first question, which is from Ellen Papoulias. What is the place of identity politics in this current situation? Do you want to address this, Danielle?
Sorry, I just put
Sorry.
the apple in my mouth. No, I think honestly, this is at the heart of the question. And when I sort of say this is a substantial victory for Trumpism, I think that's part of the victory, is that Trump has managed to define several important parts of the agenda in relationship to identity politics and a rejection of identity politics. So the fights that we're having over policing, law and order and so forth, are quite deep and powerful. And that has to be addressed. The fights we're having over history. I mean, I think it was, I don't know whether I want to sort of somewhere between laugh and cry when I saw that literally the day before the election, maybe sort of the last executive order that Trump signed before voting started was to set up this 1776 commission, the purpose of which is to more or less establish a new foundation for telling American history. And the purpose of this work is to undo the efforts that have been made for several decades to insert the story of American racial hegemony at the center of the American story. So this is absolutely a sort of core and fundamental fight, though I think it's one, honestly, that will make more progress in relationship to sort of, in the ideal, not so much tackling head on as finding ways to develop alternatives, different ways of approaching the question of how we engage the challenges of our history, its hard elements and its successes. So that, sorry, is a bit of a meandering answer, but identity politics are for real. They're at the core of the landscape as it's now defined, thanks to Trumpism. And the work is going to be quite hot, I think, over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. So more of what we have seen this summer in terms of polarization around racial.
Unless we can find, I mean, that's where I feel like, so I feel like it's sort of got a sort of tunnel under the ground that people are standing on right now where we're having that battle in order to make new space for engaging with the question of who we are as a people. Now that's a metaphor that probably doesn't make any immediate concrete sense to people, but that's sort of the general thought.
I want to, at the risk of getting myself into trouble, I'm going to say that I very much hope that the response to this 76 commission stuff or these directives through the education department is not to launch more abstract discussions about racial oppression in American history. I actually don't think there are very many people in this country who are unaware that there has been a lot of racial oppression and that it continues down to this day. And in fact, the exit poll, I think the other day, listed it as a top issue at a higher level that must have included many Trump supporters. So I think that what I hope will happen is that the issues raised by Black Lives Matter, just to give one example, about police practices, that there'll be a combination of presidential validation for taking seriously the need to work out new relationships between police and communities with very specific local engagement. And interestingly enough, many of the resistance groups that grew up after 2016 have actually done that in particular local contexts. And when it happens in particular local contexts, it happens in a much more results-oriented way. I'm not going to use the word pragmatic. I hate that word. But it focuses, for example, on getting together the local police chief, groups of families that have experienced difficulties, for example, when they call the police over a mental health episode, which happens plenty and creates a lot of these particular problems. The local NAACP and various kinds of civic and resistance groups, the anti-Trump groups. You might even get, actually you won't get any Tea Parties involved, but you might very well get some local Republicans involved. So I think that is the way to go, to encourage varied instantiations of those kinds of practice improvement-oriented conversations, backed up by a Justice Department and a president who takes the issues seriously, but to lower the level of abstraction. And one of the things that means is that academics need to butt out, because we engage in abstractions. It's not a seminar about somebody's new book about racial oppression in American history that will lead to progress. And right now, since I agreed to have this broadcasted, I'm in trouble. But so what?
Well, Theda, I'll just say I agree with you, so I'll back you up, okay?
Okay.
And I wasn't planning on writing that book anyway.
Well, nobody here probably is, but there are people writing those books.
Yeah. So Theda, Jenny Mansbridge has a question for you, if I may just pursue it. How have your on-the-ground experience given you any insight into the continuing strength of Trump supporters? What drives them and why are they still resonating so much?
Well, I've thought about that, especially since last night. You know, the one thing I found in my conversations around the country is that plenty of Republicans, I'm sorry, I have no way to shut my phone off and I'm going to do it here. Plenty of Republicans voted for Trump in the first place because they liked his economic policies. And even though he didn't emphasize that, that got baked in to a lot of people's feelings. But the other thing is, why would Trump hold those rallies in the last month and go out there openly defying? You had endless commentary in the media about how he was failing to reach out to suburban women. You bet he was failing to reach out to suburban women. He wasn't the least bit interested in them. He was speaking to men. Mm-hmm. Middle-aged working men, and I don't mean working class. A lot of Trump supporters are actually middle-class people. They may not have college credentials, but they make pretty good incomes in jobs like construction, or they're in the military, they're in the police, or they're white-collar workers of various kinds. He was, for example, when he said, "I'm going to get your husbands back to work," he wasn't appealing to the women of Pennsylvania. He was appealing to the men of Pennsylvania. And let's face it, all of us in America would like this damn pandemic over. We don't like the limits on our movements that it has brought, but the sense of what to do to get it over varies enormously, both by education level and by gender. Mm-hmm. And also varies by race, because different racial communities have experienced the pandemic very differently. He knew who he was trying to activate and appeal to, and he did appeal to them. Mm-hmm. They loved it. And those rallies result in contacts from the campaign back to those people, asking them to contact the people they go to church with, to contact the people they go to work with. They work networks. They use the rallies to activate networks. Democrats send tweets. Guess which works? Mm-hmm. Networks.
Yeah, exactly.
And aspirations.
Can I just?
Is a master of selling hope.
Yeah.
Sells nostalgic hope.
Yeah, exactly, which people need. Danielle?
I want to put a footnote on that point about how the rallies worked, because that's a super important point. It responds to the question I raised about mapping the communications ecosystem in the country as it exists now. And like, that's the map. Like Theda just told you what the map is, and everybody should listen to that and hear it. So you can't find it through television. You can't even find it through radio. You have to find it by bringing people together and then connecting to networks. And this is just something that I think political analysts have not grasped. And we will not have a complete story of the dynamics in this country until we actually fully grasp that and incorporate it into our basic map of political communication and process.
I agree with that.
So we have to entirely rethink how information is collected when it comes to the political. Stephen?
Yeah, this is completely speculative on my part, but I did allude to this. Assuming that Biden is the next president, there is this interesting question of what Donald Trump does, right? And in particular, I do not think it's entirely out of the realm of possibility that he would simply declare that he's going to run in 2024. He begins the campaign now. He continues to hold rallies. He continues to tweet. He continues to go on Fox and Friends. Fox and Friends does sort of treat him like he's the president in waiting, the alternative president we really were supposed to have had. And every move that Joe Biden or the Biden administration makes is subject to a fire hose of Trumpian criticism. Now, the interesting question for me there is, what do all of those other ambitious Republicans who really wanted to be the candidate in 2024 do? They can't challenge him because they need the support of that Trumpian base. But, if you're Mike Pompeo, if you're Ted Cruz, you do not want to wait another 4 years or another 8 years or whatever to get your shot. So there's some possibilities that some splits, at least at the elite level, start to emerge in the Republican universe, because not everybody necessarily wants to wait forever for their chance.
So
again, very speculative on my part.
We've been waiting for splits within the rights elite for 4 years now, and they've never manifest themselves. But in any event, you're right, they won't like it, but do they dare to do anything? There definitely is a movement-like quasi-religious quality to the connection that people have to Trump. And I don't say that in a condescending way. I'm actually not a condescender about this. I think it speaks to yearnings that people really do have. But it's a strong bond, and Mike Pompeo, I don't know. I don't think he's gonna be able to interfere with that bond. He's gonna try to ride the tiger.
If I could add one other point, the one thing where I think that there's a sort of the secret ingredient that Trump has had, and this was a huge advantage vis-a-vis Hillary, and I think was also an advantage vis-a-vis Biden, is that Trump is an unabashed, naked nationalist. Not just white nationalist, but nationalist. America first is an expression that, this country is what I care about. He repeats this theme in all of his speeches, both abroad and at home. And the Democratic Party has been more globalist in orientation. They don't want to do things that harm America, but they want America to be open to others. I mean, the immigration issue cuts into this as well. And it seems to me that one of the things that Democrats have to do is find a way to speak the language of nationalism. It doesn't have to be Trump's version of it, but it has to be one that says we as a party are putting the United States ahead of other countries. And that doesn't necessarily come naturally to a lot of the belief systems that I think many Democrats have. And I think the way Trump has used it has been very potent politically with exactly the groups that Theda was talking about. The sort of middle class, educated but not overly educated people who are deeply patriotic, somewhat fearful of the other, and really like a president who sounds like, even if he's a bit of a jerk, is behind the United States of America first and foremost, full stop.
Yeah, muscular nationalism is important, and Democrats should not cede it. I agree with that.
Exactly.
I've actually been arguing that for a long time because I'm a domestic realist, just like you are an international realist. But I think that we saw Biden trying to move more in that direction.
Right.
He's had a hard time doing it because he's wearing a mask during a pandemic. But I do think he's trying to talk about a more inclusive form of American nationalism.
The phrase he should use all the time is e pluribus unum. right? The
Oh, it
place
does.
where the place where the Republican or the Trump version of nationalism is in fact vulnerable is that by relying upon polarization, you are in effect saying we have to divide the society, and you cannot make the country more effective on the global stage if it's internally divided and unable to take action at home. So in fact, there is a vulnerability in the Trump version of nationalism, but it's not one that I think Democrats have yet exploited.
Mhm. Although Biden did repeat time and time again, I will be the president of everyone, which was very much in response to this concern, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he also talks about how we can't be strong if we're disunited. And if we work together, there's a lot we can do. I think what Democrats probably don't want to acknowledge is that politics works best if there's an enemy.
Yeah, exactly.
I hate to say that, but I think that's something Trump understands very well. And think about the periods
Well,
when liberalism has been able to be nationalist in the United States. They've been the periods of the great world wars. Well, that's not to be wished for. But how do you find the equivalent of something to be against, to be united against? That is not clear.
Danielle?
I think, well, I think if, that's a really interesting formulation in the sense that it really brings out the worst of our politics insofar as, in addition to Trump's projecting of external adversaries, something that, yes, the Democrats don't do, both sides project an internal enemy. And for the right, that's to project sort of socialists running around amok, sort of all over the place. For the left is to project racists running around all over the place, frankly. So I think that the anti-racism effort on the left, which is laudable in many ways, has the regrettable effect of making many people feel as if a finger is pointing at them specifically. And it may or may not be. I mean, I'm not going to get into that question, but it really does have a huge sort of alienating effect on a major portion of the electorate.
Yeah, it sure does.
This brings us to a question that I think we need answers to. So what are we, people who are in universities or elite universities, gonna do? I mean, the question of who are we as a people, how are we gonna answer it in our work? Theda, you point to the role of the mayors, Danielle to the role of the state. Politics seems to be, it should be much more local than it has been. And yet we're the speakers of the decontextualized information. So are we just to stand on the side for the next 3 years and let others speak?
Well, I don't speak for decontextualized information.
Right.
So what should we do?
As a scholar, I mean, I absolutely don't. And I think there's a big role for universities to play in, I've said this to the Harvard overseers and president, in encouraging our students who come from all over to remain connected to the places they come from and share that knowledge with us. I mean, the book that I assembled with Caroline Turbo involves 5 senior theses done by my undergraduates in their home states. It's part of a very strong empirical and theoretical argument, but it's very contextualized. So, I mean, I think actually everybody here does contextualized research, and that after all is what we must primarily do. And then we're citizens as well, and we can act as citizens in that way.
So just to build on that, I mean, so at the Safra Center, we've built up a network of mayors whom we engage in agenda setting, actually, helping us identify what they think of as the most pressing ethical challenges in their communities. And then those ethical challenges are typically connected to policy issues. And it's important, what happens as a result of this actually is it's sort of driven a change in the timetable of our research, because then once they put a question on the table as part of the agenda, they need an answer, not like in 3 years, right? But in like 3 to 6 months. So actually, I think that there's kind of a lot of reworking of the research infrastructure of the university that we could do to be much more in service to the public and much more closely connected to the public. And actually, I did suggest this to President Bacow as something that we might all think about. And he said to me, well, you should pull your faculty colleagues together to organize a conversation about this. So Michèle, I might just pass it over to you. And perhaps the Weatherhead Center could organize, literally a discussion about How do research agendas have to change if you're actually seeking to work in closer connection to on the ground policymakers and practitioners?
Yeah, that's an excellent idea, and I'm sure it would engage a lot of people. So if I may just move in a slightly different direction, Leonard Katz asked, we've not discussed Miami-Dade and Florida. This may point to larger blind spot in Democrats' people of color majority ambition, namely that not only most Cuban American, but most American of Hispanic origin don't identify as people of color and vote their class or aspired class as other upwardly mobile Americans do. So what do you make of this notion of people of color and this new majority that would really should have carried more vote for Democrats, as the identification is toward greater cosmopolitanism as a segment of the population?
Well,
Oh,
example of one of those abstractions that's a problem.
You don't think it's useful?
I mean, since I teach with Mary Waters, I know that, for example, at a very concrete level, Latinos, Hispanics get to identify both that way, and they give their race. And those who say they're white actually have different attitudes politically than those who say they're black. But why should any party or movement try to move toward the highest level of abstraction? Why shouldn't it be recognizing that, where people live and where they come from, and Cubans and Puerto Ricans are not the same. They're not the same as Mexicans. If you talk about Native Americans, they're also very different groups. And for that matter, so are Black Americans. I mean, there are plenty of, not to mention white Americans. These are very broad categories that in some ways are being pushed by the same people that are talking about national demographics in polls. And that's just not the way people live their lives or think about themselves or make connections to others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There is, at least anecdotally, with respect to Miami-Dade County, et cetera, the fact that there was a foreign policy connection here.
So of course
that the Cuban American population went with Trump in part because they have had a hard-nosed, if ineffectual, policy towards Venezuela, right? And even though they haven't accomplished any of the things they said they were going to accomplish, merely by being very anti-Maduro, that's also correctly seen as being anti, Castro's Cuba, and that resonates still with the Cuban population. This is very different than, of course, what would be happening in Texas, New Mexico, other parts of the world. Exactly to Theda's point that this is not a homogeneous community by any means. And in this case, you could play with one rather obscure foreign policy card and get a lot of votes that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how about China? Oh, so go ahead, Danielle.
Well, another way of fleshing out this point is that, political scientists have come to recognize this, I think, over the course of the last decade. Identity categories are not given a priori. They are the creations of political activity, political entrepreneurship, et cetera. And so it's a mistake. It is a mistake of pollsters to take the categories as given. It's also a mistake of the Democratic Party to take the categories as given. And instead, I mean, to Stephen's point, why does Cuba and Venezuela matter? Because there's an interest position there that actually permits you to form a different kind of set of alliances and identity relationships and to activate those. And that is really what the work of, the Democratic Party needs to rethink itself. They need to do sort of identify those kind of cross-country cutting interest areas that pull together people across what have been our habitual a priori identity categories.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one question from Jennifer Hochschild. She says, I worry that a lot of explanation for Trump's support has a psychologizing frame rather than social, religious, economic, strategic frame. Do any of you agree? And if so, what can we do about shifting the terms of the analysis? So how should we shift the argument differently? If I may elaborate on your question, instead of America first, we could emphasize solidarity, the fact that we're all humans, that, we're all children of God, whatever appeals. There could alternative cosmopolitanism that could be made more salient. What do you think?
If I understand Jennifer's question, I actually completely agree. That's why I'm a little bit uncomfortable with some of the work that's out there about the Tea Party or the Trump voter. They actually come in varieties. And I'm much more interested in knowing who relates to who and in what kinds of settings do they get their sense of meaning and purpose in life.
Yeah.
For example, churches are just so important.
Exactly.
Give an example. My friend and colleague Larry Jacobs, who teaches at the University of Minnesota, told me that he was on a North Dakota radio program. He's in Minnesota, so North Dakota, to talk about, I don't know, some kind of current affairs, probably the election. And one of the questions he got was, "Are you a member of a prayer group
Yeah.
praying for the president?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, Larry handled that, very tactfully by simply saying no.
Mm-hmm.
But then he was informed that most of the people listening were part of prayer groups that meet regularly to pray for President Trump. So thinking about the marriage of a certain kind of Christian worldview, and it's one of many, there are many different kinds of Christians, I say as a Methodist. There are many different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
With nationalism and the sense of appreciation of the manly strength that Trump brings to the table, which is greatly admired.
Mm-hmm.
Many men and women who support him with passion,
Mm-hmm.
is better understood by asking where people interact, with whom they interact, and how they talk about things. And that's very different from, say, a business-oriented Republican, who in the interviews with me will always say, "Well, I don't really like his tweets. I wish he would quit tweeting." That's what they always say. "But I sure like his policies."
Mm-hmm.
So, they're both Trump supporting people, but they're very different in the sources of the kind of meaning they get about what Trump is about are very, very different.
Yeah.
I don't like essentialism. I hate essentialism. I hate looking for the black outlook, the white outlook, the Trump voter. And I think we need to avoid that.
We have a question from Evelyn Hammond, which is, for you, Theda, despite these broad racial ethnic categories used by some, on the right, hasn't white proven to be the more potent organizing category? I mean, we may dislike them, they're simplistic, yet they're extremely salient in the discourse.
Well, I think it's true that both the Tea Party movement and Trump appeal to many whites and who feel threatened by ethnic and racial and generational change in this country. That was one of the things that Vanessa Williamson and I discovered by sitting down and talking with people.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the two major mass citizens movements of the last decade that have created widespread local voluntary groups of a kind that startled even me after writing about the demise of those kinds of groups are white-led movements. They are white and middle class, and they are white and middle class people who have profoundly different moral understandings of the meaning of American community. So in this election, you had voters on both sides saying it's an existential moment for the meaning of America. There were whites on both sides of that.
So maybe to reconnect with Stephen's presentation, how much is this meaning of America increasingly being articulated away from any concerns for the world beyond the US? Is it still relevant at all? And how about the place of China in the collective imaginary, the vilification, the villains that Theda suggested we all need in order to strengthen the collective identification? What are your thoughts? Do we know anything about also the position of Asian Americans right now in the election?
The last point I don't have any information on. I mean, first of all, this is one of the places where, in the past 4 years, opinion inside the United States and within the foreign policy community has really shifted from where it was. It was moving in that direction. Remember, it was the Obama administration that announced the pivot to Asia, and however much they tried to smooth that over, that was essentially directed against China. It was seen as a move to try and limit Chinese influence. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, this big, very controversial trade package, was as much a strategic initiative as an economic initiative. So there was movement in that direction, but that has only accelerated with the Trump administration, to the point that there isn't that much daylight between where Biden was in the campaign and where Trump is. Perhaps if there's a difference, it would be that you'd expect a Biden administration to be more energetically multilateral in trying to contain China. But remember, the Trump people have been trying to recruit, India, trying to strengthen ties with Japan. One of Trump's best relationships was actually with Prime Minister Abe in Japan. So they weren't completely disinterested in getting lots of support for doing that. And finally, one other point here is that the Trump administration was twisting lots of arms in Europe on this. All the pressure on European countries not to use Huawei technology was all part of a very anti-China direction, and that would be true, I think, in a Biden administration as well. This is one of these places where now increasingly you see the parts of the business community and the national security community lining up in various ways, where they might have been in somewhat different places 10 or 15 years ago. Now I think there's an increasing consensus that more hardball vis-a-vis Beijing is a good idea. And maybe the only debate you could have is which of these two administrations would do that most effectively, do that most skillfully. That leads to the main point I wanted to make here is you often hear the distinction being made between, well, Trump is an isolationist and Biden is an internationalist, and that's the real fault line here. I don't think that's right. Trump is a unilateralist. He is not an isolationist. If you look, the American military footprint has not shrunk under a Trump presidency. It's not likely to shrink. They've been very confrontational towards a number of countries around the world, even though these are countries that don't pose an existential threat to the United States as well. What Trump is very much a unilateralist. He doesn't like the European Union. He wants to deal with European countries individually, because the United States is a whole lot bigger than each of them individually. He thought Brexit was a great idea for that reason. He doesn't like big multilateral trade agreements. He likes bilateral agreements where the United States can twist a lot of arms. But I think it's a mistake to view Trumpism as isolationist. It's not Fortress America. It's not bring everybody home and just not trade and invest with others. It's unilateralist. Whereas I think a Biden administration has a much more instinctive desire to work with others, to maybe lead them, but to bring other democracies in particular along with the United States over a longer period of time. As I suggested earlier, though, they're going to have trouble doing that if any of their initiatives require Senate ratification, because getting 60 votes out of this Senate is going to be really hard to do.
Yeah, the point you made about foreign policy being an area of action where the president would have more option is very interesting. What do you think would happen? This is a question from Annette Idler. If Biden wins, how, if at all, will the Florida results influence foreign policy toward Latin America, and how will that foreign policy look like?
That's a great question. And I don't have a sort of a crisp answer to it. I have trouble believing, I think they will actually try to finesse this one. I don't think you're going to see Biden administrations deciding that this election says they should be reaching out to the Maduro administration and trying to mend fences. If anything, they'll try to sort of kick that one down the road. Say we're studying it. We obviously oppose dictatorship there, and we support Latin American countries who are trying to deal with all of the implications of the admittedly tragic situation in Venezuela. I think rhetorically, there's nothing to be gained by trying to do anything differently. They're going to want to keep Venezuela on page 27B of the newspaper, not on the front page, because in fact, like the Trump administration, they don't have a good answer for what to do there either.
Mhm. Yeah, I heard also that European are now really taking advantage of the fact that Trump as being a unilateralist in relation to them by strengthening their relationship in many ways. How do you see the situation in Europe evolving?
Well, the same thing we've been saying for the last hour about the United States is also true of Europe, and you know this better than I do, but Europe is not a homogeneous thing either.
Right.
So, Trump is despised in many parts of Europe, but not all parts of Europe. He's pretty popular in Poland. He has support within some parts of the United Kingdom as well. There are, I think, depending on what happens to politics in France, there's potential connections between populists in France and the Trump administration as well. So yes, I think that Europe has gotten the general message that thinking of the United States as the protector of first resort is not a good idea. This was Angela Merkel's statement several years ago, that we have to chart our own course. And I think Europeans are increasingly aware of that. I think they are worried and resentful of the sort of heavy duty arm twisting that the Trump administration has done, particularly by threatening things like secondary sanctions, moving away from the Iran deal, et cetera. And you've seen some tentative European moves towards developing ways to get around the SWIFT financial transaction system, et cetera, because they don't like being pressured by the United States. I think the lesson of this election is America can no longer be counted on as Europe's first protector, and therefore European countries, both individually, but also the European Union together, has to try and work on its own. One final point here, and I've said this now for over a year, I do think Europeans have to recognize, and this is really true regardless of whether we have Biden or Trump in the White House, that they're not going to be able to be neutral if the competition between China and the United States really heats up. Well, they can be neutral, but they can't be neutral and still expect to be getting a lot of American protection. So you can decide to sit out a Sino-American competition and then you're on your own. But I don't think domestically here in the United States, you can expect Americans to be expected to defend Germany and Poland and Estonia and Latvia if need be, while those countries are basically saying we have no role to play in any rivalry you're having with China. I just don't think that's going to be doable. And it's independent of who's president.
And against this kind of context, you think they would line up with the US?
I think most of them would. And that's been kind of the indication over the last year or so.
Even countries like Greece that are increasingly dependent on China. It's like,
well, I mean, the other point to make is that Europe is going to, and this is Europe is obviously concerned with what's going on in the United States, but Europe has enormous challenges it faces, partly the pandemic response, partly the role that Turkey is playing. The relationship between Turkey and Greece is very difficult as well. Russia is still an issue about which Europeans do not fully agree either as well. So there's plenty on the European agenda that's independent of what's going on in the United States. And maybe a bottom line here is, in this emerging, more multipolar world, all of these different parts of the world are likely to operate a bit more independently of one another than they have in the past.
yeah, as the
And Biden will do a more competent job. Some of the same things that Trump was trying to do. Trump has been incompetent at everything he has done. And I have to go, but I will say this. I think one of the biggest things we miss about Trump is that he's a patronage leader.
Yeah.
He looks for ways to do tit for tats, economy as well as in foreign policy. That makes him disturbing to businesses that want predictability.
Exactly.
Reminds me of Chiang Kai-shek, who, I studied for my first book. I always see things across vast stretches of time, and I think there are a lot of similarities. The way he operates, a family-oriented patronage operation is what Trump is about. And that's why there'll be very little sympathy for keeping him alive if he in fact loses this election. I think he'll have a harder time, shadow president, than you might think.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go.
I think that's
so
the,
much, Theda. You were
uh,
amazing. Thank you so much. We learned a lot from you. So I
I
have,
think that,
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that's the first time I've heard Trump compared to Chiang Kai-shek.
She has range.
Yeah, that's great.
So I have two questions, I think, for Danielle. So Anna Agatangelo. Danielle, can you please speak a bit more about the issue of how identity are not a given, but rather mobilized, especially in a context when a lot of money, for instance, Rupert Murdoch, is being invested to produce ideas like cut taxes, bitterness, socialists, etc., in order to mobilize whiteness? You have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, I don't actually think that the investments in circulating the frame, cut taxes, or Biden's a socialist have the purpose of mobilizing whiteness. In all honesty, I think they have the purpose of mobilizing socially conservative people. As it happens, that's a category that does align with whiteness, or the white population in this country. But that's its real purpose, is to build a kind of ideological divide, and to sort of put as many as possible Democrats under a kind of off limits kind of ideological label. As it happens, insofar as the tapping into social conservatism aligns with pre-existing racial cleavages, you do get an effect from that of building up an identity differentiation. But I would say that's exactly how it's working. So the sort of Murdoch is the sort of the political entrepreneur in that example, in that context. There's a sort of work on frames that have a sort of certain purpose about ideological framing. They have an additional byproduct effect of actually creating identity groupings.
So that's how you think it works. Okay. Do you want to comment on this, Stefan, or not really? It's not. Okay. Another question, which I think is related, from Professor Farrow, who's in the School of Medicine, is the director of the Ethics and Palliative Care Programs at Beth Israel. And he says, people build relationship through working together on a common project, not through words. Can any of you frame 1 to 3 concrete challenges that might unite people locally or in state or nationally across polarized identities? So how would that happen exactly? Possibilities might include uniting on, quote, all American children need to be able to go to school safely. And then fights can focus on what safely means, with mayors competing for their cities to show fastest how to do this right. So kind of public health, solving big problems together.
I mean, I think here and there we've seen some of this, actually. I mean, I think the best example of people coordinating around very concrete problem is a public health example. That's the opioid crisis and other issues connected to the illegal drug economy. And that has resulted in cross ideological coalitions that have supported things like arrest diversion, decriminalization, legalization of marijuana. In fact, that's the sort of, apparently one set of ballot initiatives that were successful yesterday was sort of a bunch of decriminalization initiatives around the country. So I think that would be an example, and one wants to pick out other problems of that kind in the areas of, I think, for example, transportation and housing. There are a lot of people whose economic mobility is kind of blocked because of what's going on with transportation and housing. And I think the problems cross some sort of, a priori identity politics lines of divisions in the country, and that you could productively have people working on problems like that would generate some new political dynamics.
We know that our colleague Marshall Gans has been working very actively with mayors about how to address issues of racial policing, and many people have their eyes fixated on the mayoral level as a site for social change. Is it something that you've been dealing with in the context of your work on civic culture, Danielle?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, so yes, I mean, I think that there's a lot of great work happening at the city level, as Theda sort of introduced some examples around questions of policing. I think that the work does work best when what happens is you have communities who say, look, like we've got a problem here. And we have a team that's done a study on arrest diversion programs in different parts of the country. And one of the things that's been consistent about success is that communities have said, in various ways, there's something's out of hand. Either too many people are overdosing, or we're seeing interactions between police and community that are really counterproductive. Like we can't do it anymore. And then what happens in kind of coming together for the problem solving is they tend to try to bring together kinds of expertise that don't normally connect or coordinate. So having the sort of health experts there, connecting with the folks on policing, and then beginning to build a kind of new policy approach to the problem. So yes, you can find examples of on the ground local problem solving. And I think as it happens, they do tend to connect to those rare places in our national politics where we're actually seeing bipartisan action.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add,
criminal justice reform is an example of on the national level.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I would just add the other place I can see in theory, I don't know how this would be done, but in series, assuming vaccines start to become available in the next 6 months to deal with COVID, there is a real significant coordination problem as to who is going to get access, who's going to pay for it. And you could even imagine different communities answering that question somewhat differently. To reflect, their own local preferences. How that gets coordinated from the federal level all the way down to the local level, I think is a really interesting question where, again, you could imagine people across certain partisan divides and even some intellectual divides having to sit down and try and work out arrangements that are reasonably satisfactory.
Mm-hmm. So there are pockets of American society that are asking for a much more lively and engaged civic cultures, but others don't. So how do we work toward trying to broaden this? For instance, to create citizen assemblies that might come up with rules for the distribution of vaccines. We know that the Porto Alegre budgeting, there's a lot of examples of collective decision making, less in the US though. So how do we transpose this to the US context?
So here, I think, and I've been really curious what Stephen thinks about this, but here I think it's really important to recognize something of a disjunction between Republican Party elites and Republican voters. This is not a single category. This is like it's a theme for our conversation today. And so the portrait Theda painted about the pathway toward minoritarian power is really one that I think does characterize the strategy of Republican Party elites. I don't think that your average Republican voter has necessarily embraced that as a strategy and may have like varying degrees of awareness about it. An example would be the 2016 ballot proposition in Florida, which the population voted, I think, at 60% in favor of reenfranchisement of people who have completed their felony convictions. And then the law was walked back by the legislature, right? The sort of Republican-dominated legislature. So the point of saying all of that is I think sort of in terms of on the ground community engagement, there's actually lots of room to engage people from across the ideological spectrum in various kinds of innovative civic engagement. And there's an appetite for it. And one can kind of go through a long list of like really, really micro examples that show this, and I think, it says that that's hard. They're always very micro. So we always want something that's sort of scaling up. At any rate, so I think one has to start there. And in that regard to, sort of put aside the kind of party leadership and really sort of try to build something different underneath them so that they can actually run the operation that they're running with regard to the minoritarian power strategy.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that is the kind of interest that is fed? One could say the Great American Century was about this notion of, Tocquevillian democracy in action, but yet many, many pockets of the population have been extremely passive. So the question of how do we call them into action, and if 2016 we see is not delivering in 2020 in terms of collective mobilization, people really risk running out of energy, don't you think?
Well, this is sort of where I start. I think, we've just had a massive collective mobilization, the biggest one in 120 years. So in that regard, we can't really kind of complain that people aren't mobilized, right? Like we're not allowed to make that complaint any longer. The question instead is, how do we convert that mobilization into things that are good for the country? And I know Theda thinks that sounds like kind of singing Kumbaya. Okay, whatever, I'm just gonna put that aside. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the sort of health and well-being of ordinary Americans and our efficacy on the international stage depend on sort of healthy functioning of our political institutions. And you don't get that when you have sort of 50-50 polarization. So there's a very sort of straightforward political problem that has to be solved. And I do think that the way you can solve that is by building on the mobilization and sort of with activation now at the grassroots levels. Like, don't worry about the party elites. Like, sort of tap into that 65% of voters who all voted for felon refranchisement in Florida, right? It's that cohort that we need to help figure out other things to work together on.
Yeah, and I know that's what you're working on with your current project about civic education, but how about all of us, your colleagues? I mean, we're not all working on the same topic. So it comes back to another question that was asked earlier. What's the, where should we put our energy moving forward?
Well, I mean, just to be I don't do domestic civic engagement except on a sort of personal level and on a small scale. But so what I've been working on for the last 6 months or so is trying to figure out how you reconstruct a reasonably well-functioning world order. These sort of post unipolar moment, post Cold War, et cetera, post possibly Trump. And this is some work I've been doing together with Danny Roderick, my colleague from the Kennedy School. Now, a second Trump term probably would force us to at least rethink part of what we're doing, because I think rebuilding the kind of world order we were thinking about, probably wouldn't be on their agenda for the next 4 years. And I'm not sure, given Theda's warning, that writing sort of abstract or even concrete advice on how to fix things for an administration that have no interest in them whatsoever, and without anyone else to force that agenda, makes a whole lot of sense. But a Biden administration, I think, at least would be open to that, and therefore we could be part of that broader conversation. That's much more at the global level, though, than the kinds of things that Danielle has been talking about. I was just going to add that the other great failing right now is we appear to have a political system in which there's very little accountability, or where accountability is really quite muted, because there are so many institutional protections that prevent voters who are unhappy with how things are going with expressing their views, whether it's the way the Electoral College works, the way that state legislatures have gerrymandered the number of safe seats in the legislatures. And we've seen some efforts being made to try and fix that, not to necessarily rig it for the other side, but simply to make sure that sort of voter preferences get expressed more immediately. But those have not gone very far yet. And I think we've seen in the last 24 hours that they're not likely to make a whole lot of progress from the top down in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Well, very interesting to hear about this project you're doing. I'll conclude with one last question for you, Stefan, and then we're just going to end, and maybe you can each say a word of conclusion. So it's from Angelos Chrysogelos. The point: Greece has been extremely close to the US over the last 10 years. Speculation of it aligning with Russia, China have never materialized. Biden would make aligning with the US easier. The question is, with Trump out, where will the debate about reforming international organizations like WTO and WHO go? Can we see America engaging seriously with international multilateralism beyond just a softer rhetoric?
Yeah, you'll certainly get a much more multilateral friendly rhetoric out of a Biden administration. I said, they aren't going to need to play the nationalism card, but I think they will try to make the argument, which I think has a lot of validity to it, that the United States gains actually in the long run by partnerships with others, provided those partnerships are not one-sided, et cetera. The difficulty they will face is they can do things with executive orders, as the Obama administration did. They can rejoin the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, we officially left today. The decision was out, but they could rejoin that. They can say that we want to go back to the nuclear deal with Iran and maybe refine it and do that also. through executive orders. What they're not going to be able to do is do big multilateral agreements that have treaty status. Unless those agreements are able to win over, 10 or 12 Republican senators. And I think that's going to be really quite unlikely in this environment. So there's a lot that Biden can do in foreign policy. It just may not be all that consequential in the first year or two.
Yeah, and the big patterns will probably continue in terms of the declining influence and the fractionization you've talked about.
Right.
So would the two of you like to make a final comments before we close off? Danielle?
Well, I always go around saying to people that voting matters. And one of the arguments I give for why voting matters is that it's the only way we actually, for real, finally know what the full people thinks, what the full spread of opinion is. And so I am, weirdly gratified to have that kind of point of view confirmed by the election. People vote with their vote at the end of the day. And so we really do need to know what that full spread of opinion is, because it establishes the parameters of possibility for the political work that people will undertake. So in that regard, for all the complexity and anxiety and so forth, we all have our personal investment in what we want the outcome to be. I'm just so thrilled that the turnout was the highest in 120 years. And so I suppose I want just to leave people with a sense of that being of great value and something that we should appreciate.
Thank you.
And I'm going to go in an entirely different direction and say that this has been a fascinating conversation about sort of political loyalties and norms and institutions. But for the next year, the single most important thing affecting the lives of most Americans is whether or not we get past the COVID pandemic and begin to be able to reopen not just the economy fully, but also sort of the normal social and political engagements, be in person with each other and with our students, put students in primary and secondary schools back in classrooms on a regular basis, and have something that will not be pre-pandemic in every way. There will be changes and shifts as a result of this, but at least it feels somewhat more normal. That, in a funny way, is going to make more difference to how most Americans are living their lives than who controls which particular state legislature in which particular red, blue, purple, or green state.
Well, may your wish be exhausted. Realize we're all with you there, I think, as we are all suffering from Zoom fatigue. So this has been really such a wide-ranging and thought-provoking exchange. So I really thank Danielle and Stefan. Really, I think we're all extremely appreciative. And I also want to thank the staff of the Weatherhead Center, Sarah Banks, Kathleen Hoover, the communication team. You've all done extraordinary work as always. So thank you. And I wish everyone a good afternoon. And we're all going to keep our eyes on, the news to see what's the next step in terms of the outcome of the election and where the country is heading. So you really helped us a lot making sense of what's happening. And I'm very grateful to you for accepting our invitation. So have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Yay.